Torg, 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 Torg. So, other than being really fun to say, why am I starting a channel for a 30-year-old tabletop role-playing game? Why now? What is special about this moment? In the last couple of weeks, it has become apparent that the largest tabletop war game, Warhammer 40K, and the company that produces them are no longer interested in supporting the fan base that has carried them to the acclaim they now have. This is pathetic and stupid, but is not going to change merely because a few hundred people decide to not buy their games for a couple of months. I have a very, very simple philosophy when it comes to market share. If you want to show someone how small they are, build something huge. And this is what can be done. Now, before we proceed, let us examine, one, what is going on, and two, why Games Workshop thinks doing what it's doing is remotely appropriate. Quick editorial note, the humming noise you hear in the background is the AC. I'm making this on Movie Maker. This is my first channel, my first video. I don't have anything other than free equipment. So I apologize for the humming noise, but I don't have the programs necessary to edit that out. If this channel takes off, I will go and get them. My apologies. That said, what is going on that Game Workshop believes, thumbing its nose at nearly its entire fan base, is remotely reasonable or appropriate? Anyone familiar with television advertising knows that a 30-second ad on a television show you've never heard of costs $500,000. 1 minute of promotional content is $1 million. It's $1 million a minute to advertise on TV. So every minute of YouTube content produced for Game Workshop is $1 million they save. Channels like Alphabusa, who recently took his entire content, ceased all content production in terror of Game Workshop coming after him, have 15 hours of promotional content for Game Workshop's products. That's $1 billion in advertising completely for free. And Game Workshop's response to this is to point their nose in the air and go, free. What ingrates? What pathetic, arrogant, slavering narcissism could drive you to believe that tens of billions of dollars in free promotion is not needed by your company? I have heard many theories as to why this is the case, what is going through their head at the present time. But the one I find the most credible is propounded by, of all people, Arch Warhammer. You may not like his politics, but a stopped clock is right twice a day. So, what is Game Workshop thinking right now? A recent article about a major 40K tournament stated that one of the leaders of the tournament, one of the end players, the people who got to the end of the tournament, showed up with an army that was completely 3D printed and didn't even bother to paint it. Now, nearly the entirety of Game Workshop's revenue is models. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of models sold for $25 to $100 each. And if someone can take a slab of plastic and produce an entire army for a few dollars, plastic's not expensive, by the way, it's dirt cheap, then Games Workshop's whole business model will be kaput in a decade. That's perfectly reasonable. Looking at what is happening with miniatures right now, the direction technology is going in plastics molding, that's a reasonable assessment. So, let's assume that Games Workshop is entirely correct, both in their belief that this will happen and that this will, in point of fact, happen. 10 years up the road, where will we be? What will the tabletop wargaming market for miniatures look like? eBay, Craigslist, possibly even Amazon. Entire armies of 100 units for $50. Specialty units, design your own units, $10. You want an illithid riding a beholder 4 inches tall? You can go on to eBay or Craigslist, find a printer, and go, hey, I want an illithid riding a beholder 4 inches tall. And their response will be, that will be $10. Thank you for your patronage. Happy to do business with you. Please come back again. What at that point does tabletop wargaming need? Miniatures are everywhere. In any design, in any range, in any number you wish. You want to start a Martin the Warrior wargame? You can get an entire army of anthropomorphic rabbits armed with slings by the thousands. Not hard, easiest thing in the world. So what do we need? What does tabletop wargaming need when models are everywhere? We don't need models. They're everywhere. What tabletop wargaming needs at that point is a solid rule set and a good block of lore. And that is what Torg offers. But, I hear you quip, Torg is a role-playing game, not a tabletop war game. This is true. However, Torg is not like other tabletop war games. Dungeons and Dragons was always a dueling system, you with your sword fighting the other guy with his sword. White Wolf was always a story system. If you ended up in combat in Vampire, the joke was you'd made a mistake. The same with Call of Cthulhu, or most of the other games that got published in the late 90s. They were entirely intended to revolve around storytelling, on arguing and debating and talking with people, not actually fighting anything. Torg was, from the very beginning, an action game. In the finest tradition of Flash Gordon and Conan the Barbarian, the system of Torg was intended to reflect 1 or 2 or 3 heroes fighting off an entire army in a desperate last, or intended to be last stand, that never quite ended up being the last stand. Within 8 pages of the GM section of the Torg First Edition manual, extremely clear rules supported by tables are laid out for what happens when 15 goons start shooting at you and one of your party members decides to pick up the heavy machine gun and start shooting back. These rules can very quickly and easily be transitioned into 15 goons shooting at 15 goons. Most importantly, all of which is done with one single roll of a 20-sided dice. That is the true beauty of the Torg system. The dice rolling was kept to an absolute minimum. Entire sequences of events could be handled with a single dice roll. Attacking multiple times around, you rolled once and then adjusted that one single dice roll for each subsequent attack. Attacking multiple groups of people with any kind of firearm. Again, one single dice roll, adjusted. So it is quite simple to take a block of units, fire at another block of units, and simply roll one dice and adjust the numbers accordingly. I will go into how this works in the next video. I'm simply explaining this is possible within the system. Quite easy, in fact, and does not in any way represent a problem. This is not to say there won't be problems. There absolutely will, and I will not beat around that bush for a single second. Because of how stat lines work in Torg, a simple mook will have 70 to 80 total points between stats and skills, whereas a dinosaur that can take out a tank will have only 130 or 140 points. Obviously, that's not going to work. You can't have a 15 squad cost 7 times what a tank-killing dinosaur does. One of the ways I've worked out to address this is my personal preference, you're welcome to suggest things as you like, is to take the total stats value of the unit, divide it by 10, and run it through something called the Torg value chart. We'll get into that in a future video. But for the time being, the aforementioned shock trooper would have a value of 8 for 80 stat points, thus costing 40 points to buy, whereas the tank-killing dinosaur, having 150 points, would cost 1,000 points to buy. This seems reasonable to me. Again, I will go through the Torg value chart and how I think it could be used to adjudicate point cost of units in, I believe, the next video will suffice for that. As to balancing armies in terms of equipment, that's actually insanely simple. Because of how the realms work, the realms that have a very low tech axiom, who frequently use things like sticks and rocks, usually have very high axioms for magic or spirit. So where a Nile shock trooper would have some basic body armor and a rifle of some kind, and a Dinios from the Living Lands would cast a pair of miracles on himself to give himself tougher skin and the strength to throw his spear as far and as fast as the rifle can throw the bullet. This seems a little ridiculous, I'm sure, but spears are in fact quite heavy and with enough strength does the same damage. That in turn brings us to the lore. What is going on in Torg? Well, very, very simply, the Earth is invaded by half a dozen other realities, each one with its own rules, world laws, and general understanding of how things work. Later in the story, 3 more axioms invade to add insult to injury. But we'll start with the first 6. The Living Lands is a caveman hippie reality of lizard folk and a few other things. Isle is your standard high fantasy fairies and dragons realm. Nippon Tech, now renamed Pan Pacifica to be, apparently people were uncomfortable with that name, is a realm of corporate intrigue and espionage. The Cyber Papacy is a cyberpunk realm with heavy elements of hope punk mixed into it, and a very large amount of tech heresy. Aurosh is a Victorian horror realm with extreme levels of grimdark. throughout the entire area. And lastly, New Nile, or the Nile Empire, is based on 1930s and 40s pulp action comic books. If you think things like adventure tales were just absolutely wonderful, you will love the Nile Empire. Again, each of these realms has different strengths and weaknesses they bring to the story, and in this case, the table. Living Lands is very high spirit. Isle is the strongest at magic. Nippon Tech really doesn't have an army, but they would have a pretty high-tech army. Cyber Papacy has both spirit and high-tech. Aurorish is a mix of everything, but has special rules which actually make it very competitive. The same as with New Nile. The New Nile Empire, it's not the most impressive in tech and spirit, slightly better than Cyber Papacy in tech, but there are special rules for weird science weapons. So weird science is interesting. It's a holdover from the 20s and 30s era of comic books. The only modern reference point I could possibly make was Mr. Freeze's freeze gun, the cryo gun Mr. Freeze uses in DC Comics. Most of the other interesting facets from that era have been just full-on lost to history, but there are rules for creating science devices with incredibly ridiculous powers. And again, this is something that could be easily brought to tabletop if you wanted to. So, where are we now? We have a game with a solid rule set that can quickly and easily be transitioned into a tabletop wargame. We have a gaming company running the largest tabletop wargame in the world, who seems to think its fans are entirely expendable. And we have an opportunity to show that company what happens when several $1 billion of free advertising are directed away from them. Now, before I conclude, many of you, if you go out and search the word Torg, are going to find Torg Eternity. This channel will not be covering Torg Eternity, at least not immediately. I don't have any of the books. I'm not associated with them in any way. I haven't contributed a single dollar to the Kickstarter. I am not interested in that at the present time. If this channel gets large enough, I will certainly consider getting a set of Torg Eternity books, and I will give you lore upon those books at that time. But for now, I personally am sticking to classic Torg. I don't know anything about Ulysses games, other than that they are very, very small, to the point where they have to launch a Kickstarter every single book they release, just to pay the printing costs. I don't know anything about their politics. I don't know if they have politics. They're in Germany. Meh. But I cannot imagine a startup company that is in the situation Ulysses Games is in, thumbing its nose at one of the largest online gaming communities out there, offering them help. The conversion to Army List is again quite simple, not hard at all. And I have every confidence that if, for whatever reason, a relevant or significant number of Warhammer players turned to them and said, hey, listen, we would really, really like some tabletop wargame rules for Torg, that Ulysses Games would say no. I can't imagine that. Any gaming company anywhere. Certainly West End Games, the original publishers of Torg, had they gotten more than 1,000 people showing up and saying, hey, we'd really like a war game for this, West End Games would absolutely have said yes. West End Games pulled out absurd numbers of stops to support their community. They published a monthly newsletter detailing lore updates every month for 3.5 years. Has Ulysses Games managed that yet? I have no earthly clue. No clue in the shiny blue sky. Maybe they have. Maybe they will. Don't know. But for the time being, it is worth taking a look at alternative gaming platforms to Warhammer. Again, as I said at the start, Games Workshop is not going to pay attention if a few thousand customers stop buying miniatures for a couple of months. The miniatures are going away. They know that. They're not worried about miniature sales anymore. They need to come up with a new business model that does not involve pieces of plastic. What will worry them is if all of a sudden a huge chunk of their community begins investing and pumping money into an entirely new game. That is what scared them the last time, when all of a sudden huge numbers of people started playing Warframe, or whatever the heck the other game was, instead of Warhammer, because they were sick of Games Workshop's crap. The Warhammer community needs to do that again. And I am never one to say what we should do without offering a suggestion of how we should do it.